Before I begin the playthrough of Rebirth, I'd like to say a bit about what I aim to bring to this Let's Play, and to provide some more background on FFT itself. Unlike a lot of Let's Players, I'm not a master of FFT. You can expect some fairly average gameplay from me during this run, and I would recommend looking elsewhere if you're searching for a master of min-maxing. On the other hand, I was an active member of the game's hacking community in the late 2000s, where I did fan translations of Front Mission 2 and Front Mission 5 Scars of the War. I also am a huge fan of FFT, and I've spent a long time thinking about it over the years, so I'm going to provide some games criticism commentary along with the usual Let's Play commentary you'd expect. I'll also provide you with my own translations of some of the more awkwardly translated sections of the game, since Rebirth uses the original PS1 translation and not Alexander O. Smith's translation from the PSP edition of the game. Now on to the background of FFT itself. The game was released in 1997 in Japan and 1998 in North America, amidst what was an incredibly ambitious lineup of games for Squaresoft. In 1997 alone, Squaresoft released Bushido Blade, Einhander, Final Fantasy Tactics, Front Mission Alternative, and another game dear to my heart, Front Mission 2. It was a period of consolidation in the Japanese games industry, and one where there was still a great deal of experimentation going on as well. Squaresoft was in the process of acquiring G-Craft, the small developer responsible for Front Mission, headed by the legendary director Toshiro Tsuchida, who would go on to become the head of Squaresoft's Product Development Division 6, while Yasumi Matsuno had quit Quest and began work on Final Fantasy Tactics at Squaresoft since 1995. Matsuno would go on to become the head of Product Development Division 4 at Square Enix until the tragic collapse of his work on Final Fantasy XII in 2005. Final Fantasy Tactics should be understood in terms of its place in Matsuno's career, and in terms of the development of Japanese RPGs in the 1990s. If we look at it in terms of Matsuno's career, the influence of Tactics Ogre for the Super Famicom on it seems obvious. Compared to TO, FFT is a more forgiving game, and a more focused one as well. It takes up the SRPG elements from Tactics Ogre, but it does so on smaller battlefields with less units, and introduces the crystal system where a character is given 3 turns after being reduced to 0 HP before they are permanently dead, unlike Tactics Ogre where permadeath is instant. In its story, FFT closely resembles that of Tactics Ogre, with its dark setting full of intrigue, violence, and strife, setting it apart from what became the JRPG standard in the PS2 and PS3 era of gaming. Tactics Ogre was inspired by Matsuno's observations of the Yugoslavian War, and focuses to a great extent on ethnic violence and the breakdown of political order. FFT, on the other hand, with its Lion War, seems clearly inspired by the War of the Roses, a conflict that pitted 2 noble families against each other in a fight for control of England, and was a major inspiration for George R.R. Martin's similarly dark A Song of Ice and Fire, the first book of which was published just 1 year before FFT in 1996. In FFT, we see a greater emphasis on themes of class struggle and criticism of religion than we do in Tactics Ogre, but the basic themes are similar. In both games, we start out with a secular political conflict that turns out to really be about supernatural struggle between good and evil, a constant theme in Matsuno's games. In both games, we have a conflict between rivals who begin as friends but become enemies. In both games, there is a strong emphasis on the relationship of the main character to his sister. And in both games, there is a focus on the ethical relationship of the protagonist to the political order of his society. In fact, we can see the plot of FFT as a deepened reworking of the chaotic storyline from Tactics Ogre. In Tactics Ogre, the player makes choices throughout the game that puts them on either a lawful, neutral, or chaotic path. Basically, this amounts to a question of whether the protagonist follows orders against their own misgivings, or whether they stick to their principles no matter the cost. In FFT, we will see Ramza almost always makes the chaotic choice, and the fact that this choice is removed from the player's hands allows for a more focused narrative than what was possible in TO. On the other hand, it also does less to exploit the interactive possibilities of video games, and in that sense, FFT is a less ambitious game than Tactics Ogre was. Another sense in which FFT is less ambitious is in the limited scope of its narrative. The Ogre Battle series that TO is a part of was organized into episodes in an obvious reference to George Lucas's Star Wars series, and was similarly a story of plucky rebels fighting against an evil empire. The narrative of the series was built across games rather than starting from scratch with each game. We can see a similar approach in the Front Mission series, which featured a planned grand narrative spanning 6 games, an impressive 5 of which were actually made. This approach was also taken by Yoshitaka Murayama, the creator of Konami's Suikoden, who was encouraged to pursue it by the head of the Front Mission series, Toshiro Tsuchida. Unfortunately, like the Ogre Battle series, the Suikoden series was never finished. However, despite FFT's more modest ambitions, it achieved broader popular success than these other games. Certainly, the attachment of the Final Fantasy name to the game must have had a great deal to do with its initial success, but its enduring popularity confirms that there is something about FFT that makes it a true gaming classic. The fact that FFT Rebirth was released 13 years after the initial release of FFT, and that there is a vibrant hacking community around the game, shows that its popularity isn't going anywhere. It's hard to say why the excellent components of FFT, the story and design by Matsuno, the soundtrack by Quest alumni Hitoshi Sakamoto and Masaharu Iwata, with Nobuo Uematsu playing a guest role, and the wonderful art by yet another Quest alumnus, Akihiko Yoshida, come together so harmoniously. But hopefully that will become a bit clearer as we go through the game. For changes introduced by Nexus Studios in FFT Rebirth, I recommend visiting their website, but we'll get into the details as we play. So let us begin our trip through the war-torn land of Ivalice.